Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 4, The Sacred Fire from the Philosophy of Fire by R. Swinburne Clymer. Intellectuality. It is a fundamental doctrine of the secret schools that intellectual attainments are highly desirable and to be encouraged, though mental brilliancy alone will not make conscious individuality a possibility. On the contrary, it may, and often does, give the possessor an exalted opinion of himself, critical of both the teachings and actions of those who could help him on the way, unwilling to obey instructions and prone to argue the method indicated by the instructor, thus preventing him from traveling the lowly path leading to soul illumination, the boon of immortality. The Sacred Fire, continuation of Philosophy of Fire. The appearance of God to mortals seems always to have been in brightness and great glory, whether he was angry and in displeasures, or benign and kind. These appearances are mentioned throughout the Bible. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, italics mine, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. And let the priests also, which come near to the Lord, sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. Exodus 19:16-23. We have been taught that by means of the connection made between man and God through Jesus, who became the Christ, God would draw nearer to mankind. The Lord God appeared to Moses long before the time of Jesus, when mankind is said to have been far less evolved than at present. Then why should God be unable to appear to man at the present time? Only one answer is possible. Either man has retrograded, which we cannot and do not admit, or God is just as willing to appear to man today as he was in the past, provided man brings about the conditions making this appearance possible. In these verses, it is likewise clearly indicated that it is dangerous for anyone to attempt to come into the presence of God, or the fire in which he may appear, if such are not carefully and thoroughly prepared. For he said to Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. This was the fundamental doctrine taught in the ancient mysteries, just as it is in the secret schools of the present, that man may so live as to make it possible for God to appear unto him and instruct him through the medium of the fire. And furthermore, if man attempts to come into the presence of God, or draws unto himself the sacred fire before he is fully prepared, death may result. In not one particle has the secret school changed in all these years since the mighty initiate priests ruled wisely in Egypt, since Moses led away the Israelites after the priesthood had fallen into degradation, or the time when Jesus was trained by the Essenes. In Deuteronomy, God instructs Moses what he should teach the children he had led to safety, so they might remain a great people. It would be well if the people of the present age might heed these same instructions and profit greatly thereby. For what nation is there so great, who hath God so nigh unto them, as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great, that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day? Only take heed to thyself, and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen, and lest they depart from thy heart all the days of thy life. But teach them thy sons and thy sons' sons, specially the day that thou stoodst before the Lord thy God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, Gather me the people together, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they shall live upon the earth, and that they may teach their children. And ye came near and stood under the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire unto the midst of heaven, with darkness, clouds, and thick darkness. And the Lord spake unto you out of the midst of the fire. Ye heard the voice of the words, but saw no similitude, only ye heard a voice. Deuteronomy 4:7-12. In this instance, it matters little whether we interpret this to mean that the fire within Moses, which we call the soul, thus spoke to him, or whether it was actually God himself. In the one instance, it would be the voice of God through the living soul within Moses, while in the other it would be God speaking directly to Moses. But even so, God does not speak to the material man, only to the soul of man, which is likewise a fire, as does God always appear through fire, which he is. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and held the flock to the backside of the desert, and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Exodus 3, 1-5. Why should the bush have been on fire and yet remained unconsumed? Simply because the bush here has reference to the body, the physical being named Moses, while the fire within the bush represented the soul of Moses having become awakened and into communication with God. As always happens when man travels the path which leads to illumination, the voice which spake unto Moses was that of the soul, the conscience. It was the soul become conscious and in communication with God, which spake unto Moses and instructed him what he should do. It is through this message received by Moses from God whereon is based the doctrine of the modern secret schools, as well as that of Masonry, which inculcates the tenet, requiring the profane to free themselves of shoes and ordinary clothing before they may enter the path of initiation. It is representative of giving up all that is material and destructive when one enters the path, shoes being emblematic of all that is material, earthly, and temporary. The appearances of the angel of God's presence, or that divine person who represents God, likewise the presence which is symbolic of God, are always in brightness. Or in other words, the Shekinah was always surrounded with glory. This seems to have given occasion to those of old to imagine fire as the sphere in which God dwelt. It was the fire from the Lord which consumed upon the altar the burnt offerings of Aaron. And Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle of the congregation, and came out and blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared unto all the people. And there came a fire out from the Lord, and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted and fell on their faces. Leviticus 23-24. Strange it seems that people in this age should be willing to believe God was willing to accept the offerings of the ancient people. But if one of us were to attempt to preach that incense offered to God with a prayerful heart and noble desire were acceptable to him, we would be considered as either insane or fanatics. Nevertheless, if God made laws at the creation of order out of chaos, then those laws must exist today as they did in the beginning. God being unchangeable, that which he created must likewise be unchangeable. Otherwise he would not be the unchangeable God, and being changeable he could not be eternal, since that which is everlasting and eternal must be unchangeable. In Judges we find, and Gideon went in and made ready a kid and unleavened cakes of an ephah of flour. The flesh he put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and brought it out unto him under the oak, and presented it. And the angel of God said unto him, Take the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and lay them upon this rock, and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand, and touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and there rose up fire out of the rock, and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. Then the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Judges 6:19-21. The things the ancients did in goodness of heart, manifesting thereby their willingness to be a servant in the sight of their God, was acceptable to God. And likewise is this true at the present day. God requires the services of his creation as much at the present time as he did then, if not more so, and only the unbelief of the multitudes prevents the Lord from manifesting himself unto his creatures. And David built there an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and called upon the Lord. And he answered him from heaven by fire upon the altar of burnt offering. And the Lord commanded the angel, and he put up his sword again into the sheath thereof. At that time when David saw that the Lord had answered him in the threshing floor of Oman the Jebusite, then he sacrificed there. For the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses made in the wilderness, and the altar of the burnt offering, were at that season in the high place at Gibeon. 1 Chronicles 21:26-29, at the dedication of the Temple of Solomon, God showed his pleasure by appearing in a fire and consuming the burnt offering. Now when Solomon had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. And the priests could not enter into the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. And when all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down, and the glory of the Lord upon the house, they bowed themselves with their faces to the ground upon the pavement, and worshipped and praised the Lord, saying, For he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. 2 Chronicles 7:1-3. About 100 years thereafter, Elijah made an extraordinary sacrifice in proof that Baal was not a god. And it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Jacob, let it be known this day thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their face. And they said, The Lachard, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God. And Elijah said unto them, Take the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they took them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slew them there. 1 Kings 18:36-40. Already in Genesis, man had become degraded, and through the medium of fire, God made a covenant with Abram. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Of such vast importance was it to every woman to become a mother, that when those who were barren called upon the Lord for relief from their unhallowed state, the Lord listened unto them. Thus we find in the 13th chapter of Judges, an angel appeared to the wife of Manoah. Now the wife of Manoah was barren, and the angel promised her the birth of a child if she obey certain instructions, which it would be well if all women of our most gloriously enlightened age would follow. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto the woman, and said unto her, Behold, now thou art barren, and bearest not, but thou should conceive and bear a son. Now therefore beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out at the hand of the Philistines. Judges 13:3-5. There is a sound scientific reason for the instructions given the wife of the Danite. Both wine and other strong drink, as well as the meats, unclean things, are acid in their nature, and eating of them may, and often does, create such an acidity of the system that the lochia of the woman is so acid in its nature as to destroy the seed and prevent impregnation of the ovum. Manoah desired to speak with the angel, and at his request, God allowed the angel to appear before him, though Manoah thought it a man. So Manoah took a kid with a meat offering and offered it upon a rock unto the Lord, and the angel did wondrously, and Manoah and his wife looked on. For it came to pass, when the flame went up toward heaven from off the altar, that the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar, and Manoah and his wife looked on it, and fell on their faces to the ground. Judges 14:19-20. The first appearance of God then being in a glory, or which is the same thing in light or fire, and he showing his acceptance of sacrifices in so many instances by consuming them with fire. Hence it was that the Eastern people, and particularly the Persians, fell into the worship of fire as a symbol of God's presence, and worshipped God in or through fire. From the Assyrians or Chaldeans or Persians, this worship was propagated southward among the Egyptians and westward among the Greeks, and by them it was brought into Italy. The Greeks were wont to meet together to worship their Prytania, and there they consulted for the public good. And there was a constant fire kept upon the altar, which was dignified by the name of Vesta by some. The fire itself was properly Vesta, and so Ovid said, Ne te aliud vestam, quam vivam intelligere flammam. The Prytania were the atria of the temples, wherein a fire was kept that was never suffered to go out. On the change in architectural forms from the pyramidal or the horizontal to the obelisca, or the upright or vertical, the flames were transferred from the altars or cubes to the summits of the typical uprights or towers, or to the tops of the candles, such as we see them used now in Catholic worship, which are called tapers from their tapering or pyramidal form, and which are supposed always to indicate the divine presence or influence. This, through the symbolism that there is in the living light, which is the last exalted show of fluent or of inflamed brilliant matter, passing off into the unknown and unseen world of celestial light or occult fire, to which all the forms of things tend, and in which even idea itself passes from recognition as meaning and evolves, spring up, as all flame does, to escape and to wing away. Vesta, or the fire, was worshipped in circular temples, which were the images or the miniatures of the temple of the world, with its dome or cope of stars. It was in the atria of the temples, and in the presence of and before the above-mentioned lights, and the forms of ceremonial worship were always observed. It is certain that Vesta was worshipped at Troy, and Aeneas brought her into Italy, for in the Aeneid it is written, Manibus vitus, vestamque potentem, eternumque adaitis effer penetralibus ignem. Aeneid 2:298. Numa settled an order of virgin priestesses, whose business and care it was constantly to maintain the holy fire, and long before Numa's day, we find it not only customary but honorable among the Albans to appoint the best-born virgins to be priestesses of Vesta, and to keep up the constant unextinguished fire. It is from this that sprang the Catholic Vestals so well known throughout the civilized nations. This worship was all purity in its beginning, but like many other pure religious practices, it was abused to such an extent that the underlying principle is no longer recognizable. The foundation of fire worship is in God, and no man can say it is a heathen practice who has given it any consideration whatever. When Virgil speaks of Jarbas in Africa as building 100 temples and 100 altars, he says, Vigilemque sacraverat ingem excubian divum asternas, that he had concentrated a fire that never went out, and he calls these temples and these lights, or this fire, the perpetual watch. Watch lights, or proof of the presence of the gods, by which expression he means that the places and things were constantly protected and solemnized where such lights burned, and that the celestials or angel defenders camped, as it were, and were sure to be met with thickly, where these flames upon the altars and these torches or lights about the temples were studiously and incessantly maintained. Thus, the custom seems to have been general from the earliest antiquity to maintain a constant fire as conceiving the gods present there. This was not merely the opinion of the inhabitants of Judea, but it extended all over Persia, Greece, Italy, Egypt, and most other nations of the world. Even in masonry of the present age, there can be no initiation without its lighted tapers. Why? Porphyry imagined that the reason the most ancient mortals kept up a constant, ever-burning fire in honor of the immortal gods was because fire was most like God. He says that the ancients kept an unextinguished fire in their temples to the gods because it was like them. Fire was not especially like the gods, but through it their presence became manifest to mortals. The true God always appeared in brightness and glory, yet no one would say that the brightness was God, but was most like the Shekinah in which God appeared. Hence the custom arose of keeping up an unextinguished fire in the ancient temples. God then being wont to appear in fire and being conceived to dwell in fire, the notion spread universally and was universally admitted. First then, it was not at all out of the way to think of engaging in friendship with God by the same means as they contracted friendship with one another. And since they to whom God appeared saw him appear in fire, and they acquainted others with such appearances, he was conceived to dwell in fire. By degrees, therefore, the world came to be over-curious in the fire that was constantly to be kept up and in things to be sacrificed. And they proceeded from one step to another, till at length they filled up the measure of their aberrations, which were in reality instigated by their zeal and by their intense desire to mitigate the displeasure of their divinities. For religion was a much more intense feeling in earlier days. By passing into undesirable ceremonies in regard to this fire, which they reverenced as the last possible physical form of divinity, not only in its grandeur and power, but also in its purity. The pyramidal or triangular form which fire assumes in its ascent to heaven is in the monolithic typology used to signify the great generative power. We have only to look to Stonehenge, Ellora, the Babel Towers of Central Africa, the gigantic ruins scattered all over Tartary and India, to see how gloriously they symbolize the majesty of the Supreme Being. To these upright obelisks, or lithoi of the Old World, including the Bethel, or Jacob's pillar, or pillow, raised in the plain of Luz, we will add, as the commemorative or reminding shape of the fire, the pyramids of Egypt, the millenarius, gnomon, metastone or mark, called London stone, and all crosses raised at the junction of 4 roads, all market crosses, the round towers of Ireland, and in all the changeable aspects of their genealogy, all spires and towers, in their grand hieroglyphic proclamation all over the world. Thus, in what has been written, mighty truths have been given to all neophytes, initiates, and mystics, whereby they should profit. It is the duty of those of the secret schools who are undergoing training, and while in practice, to have their light lighted, and to burn incense. For where the light and incense are, the impure elements dare not enter, and thus is the neophyte afforded protection, provided mind and heart are kept pure from impious and unworthy thoughts. Likewise, when you see the light, listen to the voice of the light, as Moses of old listened to the voice in the burning bush. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.